Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the Complex Trauma Training Center. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. If you're a mental health professional working with complex trauma and are interested in learning the neuroaffective relational model, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM therapist trainings. The NARM therapist training is an advanced clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, current mental health graduate students, and active clinical interns and trainees, where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. As you are learning and integrating NARM, you will receive individualized support from a team of skilled, passionate, and supportive trainers led by faculty members Brad Kammer, Stephanie Klein, and Marcia Black. If you are working in the field of complex trauma, we encourage you to register now to get trained in NARM. For more information and to reserve your spot, please visit www.complextraumatrainingcenter.com. And now for our episode. Dr. Michael Hannon is an award-winning counselor, educator, and researcher, a practicing counselor, and an author. He is an associate professor of counseling at Montclair State University, a mental health counselor at the Center for Marcus, and the co-founder of the nonprofit organization Greater Expectations Teaching and Advocacy Center with his wife, Dr. LaShawn Hannon. He is the author of over 30 publications and has been cited over 500 times. His book, Black Fathering and Mental Health, and overall research about the mental health of Black men and fathers has been highlighted in a range of media outlets, including National Public Radio, The New York Times, Autism Speaks, Thrive Global, Huffington Post, Waymaker Journal, and Black Enterprise. Please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Michael Hannon. All right, Dr. Michael Hannon, welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Thank you for having me, Emily.
The first question we always ask our guests is kind of to invite some curiosity here, and that really is just, what would you like our listeners to walk away from our conversation today with?
If I could draw it up, I would want your listeners to walk away better and more deeply understanding the experiences that Black fathers have, particularly in their roles and their families and their communities. And I've learned in my own experience and with the privilege of being able to talk to a lot of Black fathers and interview and treat in counseling, that much of what inspires them, I've reduced to 3 Ps. Black fathers desire to protect their families and their children and communities. Black fathers aspire to provide for their families and communities and children. And Black fathers aspire to prepare their children, families, and communities for success. And hopefully our conversation allows us to talk about some of those things and the things that you've learned and the things that I've learned. So my hope is that it'll be helpful.
Fantastic. I love that. Protect, provide, prepare. Did I get those?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, and we'll dive into that a little bit later. And also, I know you have a book, so we'll talk about those things. But one place I'd also like to just kind of get to know you a little bit. Can you share with us about yourself and what brought you to the field?
Sure thing. Michael Hannon. Friends call me Mike. Feel free to call me Mike or Michael. If you want to be formal and say Dr. Hannon, that's cool too. But, first and foremost, I'm a Black man. I have an awesome, wonderful, beautiful Black wife, and I have 2 dope Black children who are adults now. Both of them are in college. Wow. And we've had our lived experience doing our best to be partners to each other and raise our children in ways that they deserve and need, sometimes getting it right at times and other times getting it wrong or not as right, as many parents would tell you. Professionally, I'm a mental health professional. I'm a counselor by training and a counselor educator. So I spend the majority of my time teaching in a counseling program at a regional institution in my area in this part of the country. And I teach across the curriculum. I get the privilege of doing research about things that make me curious. And that's primarily about Black men's and Black fathers' mental health and well-being. And I also see clients on a part-time basis. And I've been privileged to work in 3 of the 4 settings or with the 4 specialties that we teach in our program. I've been a school counselor for years, and that was my introduction to the profession, working with high school students. Mm-hmm. People call them guidance counselors, but we say school counselors. Mm-hmm. I've been a student affairs professional, working on both historically Black and predominantly white campuses and student services roles. And right now, I'm a clinical mental health counselor at a Black woman-owned private practice in our capital city of Trenton, New Jersey, where I have a caseload of about 10 clients and attempt to do good work in ways that they need and deserve. So professionally, that's kind of where I situate. And among those things, my family is most important. And they center, arguably, all of my work. Mm. There's a lot of intersection and convergence between my professional life and my personal life and identities.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm just kind of tracking some pieces that jumped out at me as important. And I don't know if they feel relevant to you to bring in, but this piece about your personal life, how that, it sounds like that's part of what's brought you to the field. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that if you're willing to share.
Oh, absolutely. I think I had the most career clarity in my own journey when our son was identified as autistic when he was 21 months. He is now 19 years old and a second-year college student living residentially on his college campus. But it was at that time when I knew as a school counselor that I wanted to get a terminal degree to be able to help prepare counselors to work with families like mine based on my own lived experience and to do research about the psychosocial aspects of autism and other exceptionalities on Black families. And now that our children are adults, I find myself asking for permission to illustrate or illuminate our family experience because our children are old enough now to say, "Hey, I don't want to do that," or they'll say things like, in a silly way, keep my name out of your mouth, right? It's not time to talk about that, or I don't want that to be as much of an open book. But certainly that was in mental health. We all talk about critical incidents, things where we can literally demarcate our lives one way before a thing and how it exists after the thing. Sometimes those experiences are traumatic, sometimes they're not, but they certainly are really, really influential. And that was one for me.
Okay. Yeah. And I appreciate the consent piece. As a parent, I'm navigating that well myself. My older kids they're moving into their teen years and in their teen years. So along with this personal piece that kind of brought you to the field, and I know you're working as a counselor and then also as an educator. And so I'm curious how you might hold, the work that you've done and even the research that you've done and how that might intersect or cross over with some of the trauma pieces that we discussed before we press record.
Yeah, I think unfortunately the ways trauma shows up for folks, we have to as educators illuminate that for the students who will go out into the community and serve clients in ways that they deserve. And so for me, while I can't speak to experiences in my life that I would explicitly call traumatic by way of, my family experiences. Those have been thankfully relatively healthy, and we've had some challenges, of course. But when we think about the way folks and we've been traumatized by systems, I think those become the focal points in my own teaching and pedagogy, wherein I can say, there may be a student who is deserving of an individualized education plan, and the family, the caregivers, and the parents may be advocating for that student, and the way that the school responds to them in their advocacy for their child and what their child needs and deserves could be inflicting or enacting trauma and literally disrupting the caregivers, disrupting the student or the child's life in ways that many times alters their brain wiring and prompts them to respond in certain ways that they may not have otherwise if it weren't as significant or as distressing, psychologically distressing. And so I don't suggest that I'm not here to suggest that every traumatic experience that folks have or may have or be exposed to is systemic, but it's important to acknowledge how frequently that is the case, that the world doesn't know how to treat folks who they conceive or perceive to be differently than them. And as a consequence, their behavior at times may be traumatizing to the person who might be seeking services or the person who may be in need of support, and the system not knowing how to do that in ways that are caring, equitable, just, or inclusive. Does that make sense?
Totally. And I'm just appreciating right now in NARM, the model that we work with, we talk about, environments failing folks and how that can be traumatic if we don't have the resources to deal with it. And that feels, connected to this piece around if someone's reaching for resources or they need accommodations, how their environment meets them or doesn't meet them, then kind of creates this place of like needing to adapt. And so sometimes those adaptations can actually be, in the mix. So I'm just kind of holding that as you're talking about that. So yeah, thanks for sharing a little bit.
No, I appreciate that. I appreciate it. And it's really insightful and important that we continue to acknowledge it, especially when we can empirically, right? Like we can see evidence of a particular group of people who may be marginalized for a variety of reasons that are associated with their identities. And we see these persistent adverse experiences. And we have to ask ourselves, and this is sometimes in my own clinical practice and trying to be the right kind of instructor, be a good instructor for students who are coming into the field, we have to ask ourselves when we're doing our best to assess clients' needs, are those needs and those presenting issues a consequence of something internal, or are they a consequence of something external? And those are real questions we have to answer. My supervisor, she came one time and did a panel in my class, and she said that students asked her, what is the most persistent condition you see in clients? And most of her clients live in financially disinvested communities. And the knee-jerk response I thought she was going to have was depressive symptoms and depressive conditions. And she said, to my surprise and in gratitude, she said, oppression. So the oppression is the catalyst for the depressive condition, right? The exclusion is the catalyst for the mood condition that we see in clients, the mood conditions. The oppression is the catalyst for the responses to trauma that we see in children and adolescents when they're confronted by a certain presentation in a teacher or a certain presentation with another authority figure, whether that be a school resource officer or another disciplinarian in the context of a K-12 building. And it was just really insightful to hear her conceptualize that as oppression and not depression or depressive symptoms or depressive condition.
Yeah. Oh gosh, that has me thinking. Also, something else you said that kind of jumped out at me is you mentioned your supervisor. And something that we've talked about is like sometimes folks think, oh, I've got my doctorate degree. I'm like, I don't need a supervisor. I don't need someone else to bounce these things off of. So I just have to highlight how valuable and how important that is, that we always be getting, consultation and supervision.
Yeah, true story. True story.
Awesome. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more, because obviously your experiences in research and in your clinical practice as well as in your teaching. How are you finding yourself educating your students, and maybe in your clinical practice? How are you weaving in this work around trauma and supporting them in understanding systems? Because you've talked about how systems can fail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in some really specific ways. One is to help students acknowledge and increase their awareness of the frequency with which folks are traumatized or experience trauma. I was a person for a long time, and students come into our programs in their training experiences many times thinking in similar ways that they presume trauma experiences are both intense and, I'm trying to find the word, significant is not the word. They believe that students or people have to have experienced disaster in order to be traumatized.
Right.
And helping reduce some of the learning curve to say, listen, bringing real life case scenarios and client situations into the classroom. And so I can say literally in a moment, I'm seeing a 14-year-old Black boy who is a exceptional digital artist who in a moment drew something that was misunderstood. And as a consequence of that misunderstanding by his school, was expelled. And he and his family are reeling from the terrible experience of being displaced educationally as a consequence of him expressing his artistry. And as a consequence of that, he doesn't want to show me his art in session. And that's traumatic, right? Because it has literally changed the way he interprets the world and the safety therein. And it influences his behavior on a daily basis. And so after seeing him literally treating him for anywhere between 6 and 8 months, it's not until now that he's willing to share some of his art because he associated showing his art with being expelled. Right. So reminding students that traumatizing events don't have to be on the periphery or at a quick glance disastrous, even though they can be, obviously, but they can be the kinds of experiences that we might not assume to be as impactful. And they're still changing those adverse experiences are changing children and adolescents' lives and adults' lives. And this is the way it could show up. Mm-hmm. And that's just one example. And so sensitizing to them to the range of traumatic experiences and then using real life examples.
I appreciate that whole piece, because that's something that we talk a lot about in NARM, is how it's like, it doesn't have to be going to war or an assault. It can be kind of these lower level, like chronic, small, maybe misattunement by the environment, and this piece about, okay, he felt displaced educationally. You look at the trajectory of that, like it's one moment, someone might look at it and be like, well, that's not a big deal. And yet you're naming it has profoundly affected even his work with you. And
Yeah.
so I can really see how that turns out to be much bigger than maybe the one moment.
Thank you for capturing that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's one area you're kind of seeing that show up.
Yeah. And doing my best anyway to help students and other clinicians with whom I work and consult with, for whom I have deep professional respect. But we're, again, trying to be the right kind of help for our clients. And so it's, introducing the notion of trauma as something that may not be as dramatic. It's bringing real life examples into the classroom. It's also acknowledging the way symptoms may reflect being traumatized. And so whether those be loud, seemingly disruptive outbursts, isolation and withdrawing, to something as significant or severe as disassociation, right? Like it can be any of those things given the type of adverse and traumatic experience. So associating some of those symptoms of having traumatic experiences are also ways I try to bring in that content into the classroom and then obviously into my clinical practice in my own work with clients.
Yeah. I appreciate you talking about that. And I know it's personal too. And also, there's a certain amount of like in your clinical work, there's probably only so much you can say in terms of your clients. But I wonder if you have any other examples of that, because you're kind of like you're in the thick of it, but then you're also in the educational part of it. So I wonder if there's any other examples that you might share with us.
Oh, sure.
We could probably go all day.
Absolutely. I'm thinking of a client with whom I worked who is a 26-year-old Black man who came to get counseling support because he didn't feel like he had the agency in different domains of his life, in my work, in my personal, particularly romantic relationships, and in connection with my family. And this younger guy, younger than me, I'm 48, but this younger guy who was 26, he experienced his mom dying of cancer as a 16-year-old in his senior year and didn't realize the traumatic effect of his mom's passing until 26 when he gets therapeutic support and realizing that his responses to his family, because he felt abandoned by his older brothers and sisters, his older siblings, was a consequence, arguably, right? Nothing's an exact science, but we can begin to think about all of these pieces and see if and how they may be connected. But his response to feeling abandoned by both his mom, even though that's hard for him to acknowledge, right? Harboring anger and resentment that his mom had to leave him at that early point in his life, and that no one in his family, as the youngest sibling of many, that none of his older siblings cared for him in ways that he thought he needed and deserved. And so having to go through 17, 18, 19, 20 through 26, essentially feeling like he's had to fend for himself. I said, hey, man, I know a lot of times we talk about trauma with respect to assault and war and exposure to violence and things like that. I said, there's an argument here that I can make. And I hope that you might consider that the passing of your mom and the consequences thereafter have been traumatic for you. And those are the things that might be feeding the anxiety symptoms that you described. The challenges you have with sleeping on a regular basis soundly, and the challenges you have with maintaining a consistent wellness routine, and even some of the more interpersonal things like the anger and rage you feel like you have to contain when it comes to interacting with your family because you're so hurt. You've been emotionally injured and the injury has not healed. And the irony is, Emily, is that this man was a former college athlete. And so being able to use the metaphor of having injuries and then having to heal from injuries and recognizing how environments and the weather influences the flaring up of symptoms, it was able to resonate with him in ways that I don't know that he understood before or appreciated. I'm not going to say he didn't understand it, but certainly he didn't maybe appreciate it as much to consider the passing of his mom and the consequences thereafter were traumatic for him. So
I appreciate like your use of, if he's an athlete, finding a way in, right? Like finding a way to kind of his language of like what's going to land for him. And sounds like you were able to do that, which is so beautiful. And this piece too of just recognizing, okay, you didn't go to war, you weren't assaulted, there wasn't like gun violence, it wasn't anything like that.
Right.
And this again really changed the trajectory of like your relationships with your family, your ability to like reach for support because there's this underlying anger and pain.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. I'm curious in your, teaching capacity. Do you do kind of case studies like this with your student, or how do you find yourself teaching these kinds of concepts?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, case studies are always, in my teaching experience, they're always really, really helpful. Those of us entering the helping professions in whatever capacity you're going to serve, to be able to apply the content that you're learning to a real case scenario is as close as you're going to get to actually having somebody sit across from you, whether it's on a screen or whether it's in person in an office, in a classroom, or things like that. So case-based examples are certainly things that we use. Instructional strategies, bringing in multimedia resources. So it's one thing for me to talk about a particular type of intervention. It's one thing for me to talk about trauma-informed care. It's another thing to see it in practice. If I can access videos so folks can actually see what it sounds like to respond to students' needs or clients' needs in a way that is trauma-informed, that allows for much deeper connection to the content, and it humanizes the folks who are on the other end of those services. Right. It's one thing for me to say, hey, I have this client, but if we give this client an alias and I give you a little bit of personal information that I've experienced with him, or a personal anecdote that I've had with this client, that's something different than just reading it on a paper. And if you're watching a screen and you're seeing people in session apply concepts, intervention, draw on theory, and you're seeing the other person on the receiving end of those services respond somatically, interpersonally, emotionally, that's like, I don't mean to minimize it, but that's like good food. That's the kind of food that sticks to your bones, right? That you're not gonna forget that, and you take that with you, that sensitivity, that humanizing dimension, when you actually have a client in front of you. So those are some of the other kind of instructional strategies, using media, using case-based examples, and then having folks come in who are actually doing the work, folks who may be way more experienced than I am, and drawing on their expertise to illustrate and illuminate the ways that we do our best to meet clients' needs, particularly those who have been traumatized and are walking around living many times with the trauma that they've experienced.
I love what you're saying here. And I just got to say, that's my favorite, like learning. And again, I'm continuing in trainings and ongoing support and supervision and all of that. But that's my favorite way to see, is either to watch a live session, which is so, I get really invested. I'm right there. And then to even watch videos, or even just have a case study, presented, but like you're saying, giving a little bit about like your experience with them and their, what's happening in their lives. That's my favorite way to learn, because like you said, it humanizes it. It's really beautiful. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about your book and the work that you've done in that realm. Black Fathering and Mental Health is the name of your book. It came out last year. And tell us a little bit about, what drew you to write the book and what you're doing with it.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. So the book is Black Fathering Mental Health, published by Peter Lang Publishers in March of 22. The book, I believe, I'll stand on this 10 toes down. Emily, I'll say the book is unique and contributory because, if for no other reason, there's no other book on the market that centers the voice of Black men and Black fathers and father figures, that allows them in their own voice to talk about their fathering experiences across different points in the lifespan. So I'm talking about conceiving with my partner. I'm talking about the possibility of adoption because I'm a same gender loving man. I'm talking about getting my kids ready for school, knowing anti-Black racism exists, and it exists in all of our systems. I'm talking about raising my adolescents. I'm the child of a Black father, and I'm talking about what it means to consider what his mental health needs were in the time that he was raising me, a Black father who's in an interracial relationship, and my children are bi or multiracial. And so every single chapter is written by a counselor and talks about raising their children or preparing to raise children at that point in time in their lives, and their mental health needs during that time. But because all the chapters are written by professional counselors. They offer recommendations to mental health professionals who may be serving Black father clients who have a similar lived experience. And so every chapter has not just their story and narrative, it has recommendations for mental health professionals who may have Black father clients. It is an edited volume. And I'm so fortunate to have been able to assemble this wonderful collage of Black counseling professionals, not all of whom are men or identify as male, but they've all, they've given us something really, really valuable. And it was my vision, of course, but I'm super grateful to have had them contribute to it.
So it's not just for Black fathers. This is for any clinician, anyone who is raising a Black child. I just am so appreciative of what you're giving to the world with this work.
Oh,
and so since it came out, I'm curious what the response has been and what you've noticed and how is it trickling out into the world?
Yeah. To your point, right. It's not just for Black fathers. It is for anybody who is in community with Black men. If you care about Black men, pick up the book.
We should be picking up the book.
So it's been received really well, and I'm grateful for that. It's been covered by the New York Times. It's been covered by NPR, particularly not this past Father's Day, but Father's Day 2022. Father's Day and Juneteenth fell on the same day.
Yeah, that's right.
And so it was a really, really dope kind of convergence of the celebration of the book coming out and folks catching wind of it and giving it some press, giving it some shine, but also talking about the implications of what it means in the context of Juneteenth and the pursuit of and celebration of Black freedom. So that was really great. The publisher continues to tell me that it sells well. So I'm grateful for that. And, it has led to some opportunities for me to provide some professional development and go to conferences and share the things that I'm learning. And one of those things is what I opened up with when you asked me what I want listeners to walk away. I think in the time that I've been able to do research, reflect on my own experience as a Black father, and do research with Black fathers, particularly Black and Latino fathers of autistic people, doing the book project. I think what I've learned is just that, those 3 Ps, right? Like at the end of the day, and I don't want to reduce this, but certainly the Black fathers who I talk to, and I think this speaks globally, right? To the global community of fathers, that they are socialized. Many times they take pride in, and sometimes are judged by the extent to which they're able to protect, provide, and prepare their families. And whether it's right on the surface, right? So if I'm working with a Black father client and it's right on the surface, now I got to provide. Well, that provision looks a number of ways. We've been socialized many times to think that provision looks solely financial. But these Black fathers I've had a chance to work with and be in community with, they're talking about financial provision, obviously to the extent that they can, but they're talking about emotional provision. They're talking about the ways that they provide for their families that may not be able to be enumerated, but are still critical to their children and their families' well-being. And so those 3 Ps, they tend to show up all the time. And I think the last thing I'll say is, you may or may not know, I co-lead a father's support group for dads of autistic people. It's a virtual group and we do it on a monthly basis. And I have a colleague who introduced the concept of protecting autistic joy, right? So this colleague of mine, her name is Renee Mays. She's a faculty member, I think, at the University of Arizona. And she invited my wife and I, who's also a doctoral level educator, to write a paper about how we attempted to protect our son's Black autistic joy when he was a K-12 student. And so I floated this at the dads group that we just had on Saturday. Like, we're talking, we're coming up on the Thanksgiving holiday, or for folks who observe it. So we're talking about gratitude. What are we grateful for? Where's our gratitude resting right now in this moment? And, guys were sharing, we probably had about 20 guys in the space, virtual space. And I was like, hey, y'all, like this has been sitting with me. What does it mean to protect our kids' autistic joy? And it just resonated, right? Like, and the group is super diverse, right? Diverse racially. It's got neurodiversity. We have autistic fathers in the group. We've got, folks from all across the country who come and show up on a monthly basis. And these dudes, they felt so seen and heard. And for me, it was, when I think about protection, right? In those 3 Ps, protect, provide, and prepare, my instinct is to talk about protection from harm. When that's part of the puzzle, sure. Right? No pun intended. That's part of the puzzle. But what does it mean to protect the joy? that our families experience. And as dads, what does it mean for us to not just protect them from harm, but when we see that our children are experiencing joy, what lengths will we go to protect that joy? And so I'm recalling stories of when my son was younger, and because of his sensory needs, he would randomly just touch my nose, right?
Yeah.
May seem awkward to other people who are looking at us like, yo, what's going on? He's touching my nose and touching my nose and rubbing my nose and rubbing my nose. And, in the moment when I was a younger father, I'm like, sometimes it would be annoying, or sometimes I'd be embarrassed, or I'd be thinking about what other people thought.
Mm.
But if that brought my son joy, then I need to protect it, right? And so it just really resonated with the guys. It resonated in a new way with me that I had never considered before. And it was a real aha moment that, we may work hard to protect our kids from trauma and traumatic experiences. And that's super important. And that's something we can take pride in. We can't do it on our own, obviously, right? We do it in community. But when we can protect their joy, that's another layer or level of fathering and parenting that has become especially resonant for me.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. It's landing for me. I'm having my own moment over here. Listeners can't see, but wow, that really hit me in a profound way. Obviously my story's a little different. We don't need to get into it, but I have my own kind of experience with this. Yeah, I'm just thinking about boundaries, this idea of boundaries, yeah, we want to keep what's harmful out, but boundaries are also about keeping what's beautiful in.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And that's what's really landing for me as you share that. Thank you so much for sharing that. Because I know sounds like this just happened Saturday.
Yeah.
Fresh experience.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
I appreciate the chance to share it. Thank you.
Yeah. That's really beautiful. And thank you for sharing about your book and the work that you continue to do. I feel like there's something else I want us to get into, and I don't know yet what it is. Is there anything coming up for you? Energetically, I'm feeling like there's probably so much more we could talk about, but I'm wondering if there's anything that feels to you like it's important, it's floating to the top.
Well, I think what I'll share is, and I haven't shared this publicly, that I do have a second book contract that I'm super excited about, and it's literally about these 3 Ps.
Cool.
And so I'm assembling. This is going to be a solo authored project, but it's not without the contributions of other fathers and father figures for whom I have deep respect. And so right now, I feel like I'm convening like this league of extraordinary gentlemen.
Cool.
And I'm going to ask them over the course of 3 or 4 interviews, how do these 3 Ps show up for them in the ways that they father? What does it look like to protect your children from harm and to protect their health, safety, and joy? What does it mean to provide for them, and in what ways do you do it and try to do it, or have attempted to do it but haven't done it as well as you wanted to? And what does it mean to prepare them for the world that sometimes, many times, doesn't love them and can be anti-Black, and how traumatic that can be for them as it is for us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm excited about that. It's due out in December of 2024. So, we're in the beginning stages of kind of, pulling the information together, and I'll be doing some synthesis of those meetings. But I'm super excited about it. And I haven't talked about it publicly because it feels like it's so far off. But given the course of our conversation today, it feels natural to share.
I appreciate you sharing it. And by the time this posts, that actually won't be so far away. So folks can put that on their calendar, December 2024. Be watching for that. I'm really excited. And I'll be honest, Mike, this is my first introduction to your work. So I haven't read your book yet. I'm really looking forward to it. And so thank you for, sharing what's coming up. That's really exciting. Cool. So maybe that was it. What felt like it was left at something else. He needs to say something else, or something else we need to explore. So maybe that was it. But also, is there anything else, in terms of your clinical work, teaching, that feels relevant that you want to share?
Yeah, I'll share an anecdote that I'll frequently say to anybody who listens, that my wife, Dr. LaShawn Hannon, she is exceptionally smarter than I am, sharper, quicker. And I can remember, this is in the context of providing care, trauma-informed care to folks. Before she became a faculty, a higher ed faculty, college faculty, she was a high school English teacher for 15 years. And in our home, when our children were younger, we developed this saying called the right kind of help. And it came kind of in jest, because when each of us would have our task, I'd be responsible for doing the dishes, one of the kids would be responsible for mopping the floors and sweeping, and somebody's responsible for vacuuming. But the joke was, if you did a bad job, you were the wrong kind of help, So, if you're going to vacuum the floor, don't be the wrong kind of help, right? But we flip that on its head and we say, and LaShawn and I both, we find ourselves when we have opportunities to talk to folks or people ask us to do some consulting work or like whatever, being in community with people. At the end of the day, what's it mean to be the right kind of help, right? Like, I may be in conversation with you, Emily, and you may have a particular need, but if I can't read the signs that you're giving me, whether they're verbal, whether they're in your nonverbal body language, whatever our conversation about may not be the right kind of help for you. But if I'm brave enough and humble enough to be like, what will be helpful? Now I'm on a pathway to being the right kind of help versus being the wrong kind of help. Because what I don't want to be the wrong kind of help. But when we can exercise the amount of humility in service provision, in teaching, in clinical mental health counseling, in running an organization, if I'm bold enough and courageous and humble enough to be like, I just want to be the right kind of help. Like, that's it, and the right kind of help one day could be me shutting my mouth and just listening. Mm-hmm. The right kind of help on another day could be me offering some measure of reflection, like, hey, this is my interpretation of what I think I heard or saw. And another day, it may just be me going to the location with you to get some groceries. But the impetus to be the right kind of help has become really, really important for not just me in my own professional life and professional identity, but just hopefully in the way that I move and live, that I just want to be the right kind of help.
I appreciate that's a beautiful place to end. I've actually been talking recently. I've had a few conversations about when help isn't helpful, kind of the flip side, and how clients can become really discouraged when they're engaging in therapy or counseling, and they're like, "Well, I guess this doesn't work for me." And it might be that the clinician isn't you named. There's got to be a humility piece there. There's got to be some genuine curiosity. We have to be willing to not have the answer and meet them where they are. And so exactly what you're saying, I love that. And that's a beautiful place to kind of wrap up. I really appreciate you, Mike, for coming on the podcast. And where can people find you? How can they come in touch with your work?
Sure. On social media, I can be found on Instagram and Twitter at DRMD Hannon. Like just literally just like Dr. MD Hannon. I am on LinkedIn at Michael Hannon, PhD. And if for folks who use Facebook, you can find me on Facebook just with my name, Michael Hannon, my full government name, Michael Hannon. And my website is mdhannon.weebly.com. If folks want to get a sense of the scope and sequence of the things that I'm doing, both research-wise on the clinical side and stuff in the community, and access to some of my research and publications, whether it be the book or some academic papers and things like that. So that's how I can be found.
Fantastic. And we'll put those in the show notes. And of course, your book, Black Fathering and Mental Health. And we'll put all those goodies in the show notes for folks that want to reach you.
Thank you.
Thank you again. It's just wonderful to hear from you and about the work that you're doing. We appreciate it.
Hey, the pleasure's been mine, Emily. Thanks for this opportunity, and my best to you and yours.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Peace.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more information about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at complextraumatrainingcenter.com/transforming trauma. You can also connect with us in other ways. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. If you're a licensed mental health professional working with complex trauma and are interested in learning the neuroaffective relational model, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM therapist trainings. The Level 2 training is a clinical training where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. As you learn and integrate NARM, you will receive individualized support and join an engaged professional community of therapists passionate about healing complex trauma. Learn more about this training and reserve your spot by visiting www.complextraumatrainingcenter.com. The Complex Trauma Training Center emphasizes professional development in support of personal growth. We provide clinical trainings, online webinars, ongoing consult groups, mentorship programs, and community events. Our mission is to provide a relational, inclusive, and depth-oriented professional community for those seeking a supportive network of therapists working with complex trauma. To learn more about our trainings, programs, and events, please visit us on our website at complextraumatrainingcenter.com. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Elisa Sponseller for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.